I'm Michael Bordo. I'm a professor of economics at Rutgers down the road. I'm also visiting here at Princeton, and I'm also at the Hoover Institution where our speaker is from. So Jennifer Burns is going to talk about her new book on Milton Friedman. Uh, I've known Jennifer a long time because I go out there, and she is a noted historian at Stanford University. And her specialty, if I want to say it, that is she's interested in the history of ideas. And her previous book, which received a critical acclaim, was on Ayn Rand. Okay, so and and the other people who are on this panel are discussants are Carolyn Wilkins, who is here at the Griswold Center, and she is a former deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, and she is a member of the Financial Stability Board at the Bank of England, and she's here at the Griswold Center. And our other discussant is Harold James, who is here at Princeton. He is, I'll call him a European economic historian and also a global thinker. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just for a couple of seconds, just introduce the book and give some remarks, and then we'll turn the thing over to Jennifer. So Jennifer's written an excellent book. In it, she tells the story of Milton Friedman's life and career, Milton as a warm, caring, and generous human being, Milton the brilliant economist, Milton the debater who took no quarter, and some people here at Princeton, a previous generation, know about that. Milton the advocate for free markets and sound money. So Milton Friedman was one of the two leading economists of the 20th century. It's debatable whether he or John Maynard Keynes had more influence. Many economists today remember him as a champion of free markets and for the monetarist Keynesian debate of the 1960s, 70s, and his slogans from back then: money matters, and inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And we just had a period of inflation where Friedman was quoted a lot. Okay, and especially what's remembered is the analysis that he did with his co-author, Anna Schwartz, that policy mistakes by the Federal Reserve were the cause of the Great Depression of 1929 to 33 in the US and the rest of the world, and he made the case for the pursuit of a money growth rule. He's also remembered by economists for the permanent income theory of consumption, his work on optimal stabilization policy, and the natural rate of unemployment, and this is the reasons he got the Nobel Prize in 1966. But not only was Friedman a great economist, but also he was a world-class public intellectual and communicator. His ideas on free markets had a huge influence not only in the US, but across the globe. He was an advisor to Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and in the UK to Margaret Thatcher. His ideas led to Paul Volcker's Slaying the Beast of the Great Inflation from 1979 to 82, and this was followed by other countries. And many of the successful liberalizations reforms after the collapse of the Soviet Empire were strongly influenced by his ideas. His case for floating exchange rates, a negative income tax, a volunteer army, charter schools, all came to pass, as is well described in Jennifer's book. So I knew Friedman as a student. He was a student at the University of Chicago in the late 60s when he was my student advisor and then director of my PhD dissertation. I was part of the monetary economics phase of his career when he was at the very top of his game. In the 3 decades before I came along, Milton was already one of the most highly acclaimed economists for his seminal articles in price theory and many other topics. And Friedman's work on the modern quantity theory of money, his critique of the prevailing activist Keynesian orthodoxy, reached its peak when Paul Volcker vanquished the great inflation following his script. And it was a long and arduous struggle for Friedman, and this is excellently documented by Jennifer. before the economics profession and policymakers accepted Friedman's message on the importance of monetary policy and control of the monetary aggregates in stabilizing nominal income, prices, and economic activity. Now, a key pillar, and Jennifer will talk about this, in Friedman's monetarist agenda was his collaboration with Anna Jacobs Schwartz. And I was lucky, I worked with her for 4 decades. And Friedman and Schwartz are best known for, as I said before, their book, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960, especially Chapter 7, The Great Contraction, 1929 to 33, and for definitively demonstrating that the Federal Reserve, by not preventing 4 serious banking panics, 1920, 30 to 33, acted as acting as a lender of last resort, not acting as a lender of last resort, which was a reason for the Fed's founding. That allowed the money supply to contract by over 1/3 and crush the economy. Now, modern macroeconomists praise Friedman and Schwartz for their narrative approach to identify the causal influence of monetary changes on the economy. Of course, there's a lot more in Friedman and Schwartz in the Great Contraction, as my colleague Hugh Rockoff, who's over here, and I have written. So Jennifer gives equal credit to Anna Schwartz for the success of A Monetary History. And what she states, she quotes me, she says, he couldn't have done it without her. And Anna Schwartz was a brilliant economic historian and empirical economist. She knew more about monetary history, monetary statistics, and the monetary institutions of the US and the UK and elsewhere than anyone ever, although maybe AI will match her. And when she died, it was like the destruction of the library in ancient Alexandria. And Anna was not a theorist, as Milton was, but she saw through the heart of every fad in macro money long after Milton had ridden off into the sunset of California and became a public intellectual. So Jennifer's book is a must-read for anyone interested in understanding the influence that Milton had on modern economics and monetary policy, as well as the resurgence in the free markets. So, Jennifer, you take it.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks everyone for coming out, and thank you to the Julius Rabinowitz Center for inviting me. I have been in academia for 20 years, but this is the first time I've ever set foot on Princeton's campus. So it's really special to be here, and I hope it won't be the last. So the book that I'm going to talk about today is not the first biography of Milton Friedman, but it is the first archivally driven, comprehensive account of Friedman's life that takes you from his days as a Boy Scout in Rahway, New Jersey. Here he is. He's the one with the rather fetching cap here. And you all know where Rahway, New Jersey is because we're here in Princeton. And actually, the first stop in my research for this book was to go to Rahway and to go to the local historical society and to have lunch in the Chinese restaurant that is now the site of the dry goods store that Friedman's parents ran for a living. So I take you from Rahway all the way to the cover of Time magazine in 1969, where here Friedman appears as a sort of prophet, predicting a recession or not. And they have to remind you that in a consolidated media landscape with sort of 3 major news magazines, to appear on the cover of Time magazine in 1969 was some pinnacle of cultural achievement in the United States. So as I look around the room here, I see that probably some of you know a lot about Friedman. Some of you may not know much about him at all. And there are so many ways I could introduce him to you. I could talk about him as a Nobel Prize winning economist who is famous for his attack on the Phillips curve, for his theory of permanent income, for founding the school of economics that came to be known as monetarism, which we could summarize in the dictum, quote, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Or we could talk about him as a great champion of free markets, the author of books like Capitalism and Freedom, which is kind of his manifesto to the public. the star of the 1980s television series Free to Choose, which is out there in the wild in YouTube. If you're looking for some 80s kitsch, I highly, highly recommend it. You'll see cameos from lots of people who go on to be famous in different ways. So you may know him as this great champion of free markets. Or we're at a policy school. He's also a policy innovator, in some ways one of the most creative policy innovators in the mid-20th century America. So let me just list some of the proposals he made that became reality, that when he first proposed them seemed like the sort of ravings of a madman. The idea that income taxes would be withheld from your paycheck at source rather than sent separately to the IRS. And armed forces that relied heavily on paid volunteers rather than draftees. States supplied educational vouchers to cover the cost of public school tuition. A negative income tax, the forerunner of what we talk about as UBI, universal basic income, or the earned income tax credit, or tax rebates in general, ideas that Friedman pioneered. The vision of a world where international currencies float one against another, trading on an open market rather than set top-down by governments. So these are all ideas that Friedman had, many of them in Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. Again, seemed like really wild ideas. Fast forward 10 or 20 years, and they're part of the world we live in. So as I plunged into this project, starting in Rahway, continuing on, I really found I was dealing with three Friedmans. I was dealing with Friedman the economist, Friedman the policy thinker, and Friedman the public intellectual. And I really try to tackle them all in the book, and they weave throughout this story. And some chapters, one of the Friedman comes to the fore more than the other. But there were these three roles that were overlapping, complementary, and in which he really distinguished himself. So what I just want to do today is highlight a few episodes I cover in the book. And I want to spotlight some of the arguments I made. It's a narrative-driven project, but there is an analysis within the narrative, and there are specific arguments about Friedman and the broader world embedded in it. Today, I just want to focus on three in particular. I want to focus on the consistency in Friedman's thought over time, which I uncovered in my research. I want to talk about the vital role of women in his work throughout his career and their contributions. And then I want to talk about Friedman's impact beyond economics. I've hinted to some degree of his role as a sort of ad hoc policymaker, and talk a little bit about that. So let me begin with this idea of consistency. And so I said my first stop was Rahway, which was true. My second stop was Chicago. And I went to the University of Chicago, and I tried to understand what Friedman would have encountered when he arrived there as a student in 1932. When Friedman arrived in the fall of 1932, it was approaching the nadir of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment nationally. The banking crisis would unfold over the course of his first year. And this would prove a really formative experience for him. As I said, he had grown up in Rahway, New Jersey. This was an unusual background for an American Jewish family. His family was one of the few immigrant families who didn't just stay where they landed, but carried on to small town America. He went to Rutgers as an undergraduate. Most likely he would not have been welcome at Princeton at that time, despite his brilliance. Then he carried on to the University of Chicago. And as he recalled it, looking back, it was really the economic crisis that made him choose. He was choosing between mathematics and economics. And economics seemed to him to have more relevancy in the middle of an economic crisis. So that was what he chose to focus on. Now, we also know that this economic crisis of the 1930s was a political crisis across the globe. And it was a crisis of democracy, one might say, a crisis of liberal democracy. Social democracy, fascism, communism were on the rise in Europe, in Asia, seemingly across the globe. And Friedman was immediately immersed in these questions because the teachers that he gravitated to and found most influential considered themselves classical liberals and considered themselves custodians and guardians of a tradition that was now being really challenged and questioned. So I have in mind, in particular, two of his most important teachers, Henry Simons and Frank Knight. And these two are major characters in the book. Simons, in particular, weaves in and out, and there's a really critical moment when Justice Friedman, later in life, is returning to Chicago. Simons commits suicide. So there's a really sort of set of would have beens had Simons lived. For now, though, I just want to focus on the intellectual culture that they created at Chicago at this time that Friedman was immersed in it. So Knight and Simons both thought of themselves as, they would say, old-fashioned liberals. Today we might say classical liberals. But they knew that this idea of classical liberalism, limited government, individual rights, constitutional government was really under threat and under strain, and not simply by communism and fascism, but by new alternatives in, let's say, the electoral market. In other words, they knew that with the extension of mass franchise, people were turning to different political solutions. Voters, simply put, were not buying what they were selling. How could it be reformulated? How could you take the principles they held and apply them to a new age? And so this was some of the questions they were wrestling with. What's important to note, though, is that they believed strongly that the government, the federal government, had a role to play in the economic crisis. And this was something I was not necessarily aware of when I first plunged into my research. So men like Simons and Knight rejected laissez-faire economics despite their free market orientation. And so they were trying to answer this question: how to safeguard market activity, market society, and ensure broadly shared prosperity. And they weren't sure how to do that in the 1930s, but they felt like this was a question that had to be answered. And it's really, I would say, a sort of question of the ages that we return to fairly regularly and try to figure out that balance. So out of this question came two Chicago responses to the Great Depression. The first was the Chicago Plan. This was a set of reforms that Friedman's professors sent up to the Hoover administration and then to the Roosevelt administration. I won't summarize here except to say many of their proposals were adopted in the Banking Act of 1935. In fact, some of them were even more radical than what was ultimately adopted. They would have, for instance, abolished fractional reserve banking entirely, which would have completely changed the way the banking system works. So the second aspect of the Chicago, and let me say, when they look at the Chicago Plan, they're really focusing on the banking sector and the financial sector as sort of core parts of the Great Depression. And that's the early seed of Friedman looking at the role of the Federal Reserve in the Great Depression. Now, the second Chicago theme is a pervasive worry about inequality, that it's bad for itself, but it's also bad for social stability, and how to figure out and sort of address this problem of capitalism generating inequality, yet being within a democratic system that values equality, at least political equality. So both of these become important themes for Friedman. The focus on banking, on money, and financial institutions he gets really early. And then the effort to balance capitalist dynamism against calls for social equality is also something he's thinking about for much of his career. Now, arguably, I'm talking up Henry Simons and Frank Knight, but arguably even more important than them is what I call the Room 7 gang. Okay, Room 7, this may be a picture of Room 7, it may not. It's a storeroom in the basement of the Social Sciences building in Chicago that Friedman takes over with his best friends, and they go down there and they have like jam sessions, mostly about what did Frank Knight say, what's going on in the class, you know, the typical kind of graduate student bonding. But this is not typical graduate student bonding because these men stay deeply connected, and they end up going to the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1947. So here's Room 7. There, the short one without the mustache is Friedman. The really tall one is George Stigler, who will spend much of his career at the University of Chicago. And then the man with the mustache is Friedman's brother-in-law, Aaron Director, a really pivotal member of this group. So there's a creation of a very thick student culture and intellectual culture that Friedman gets at Chicago. And he comes out of Chicago with these two major orientations that won't change. One is an interest in the monetary dimensions of the Great Depression, which will become the basis of his ongoing research. And the other, as befits the classical liberal orientation of his teachers, is a skepticism of the New Deal. Now, how do I know this? And this is a little tricky because Friedman does say he voted for Roosevelt. Does that mean he's a New Dealer? I don't think so, because I have lots of other evidence about what he's thinking. And most of it comes from archival sources, letters, drafts, things I've dug out of either Chicago or the place where his major papers are hosted at the Hoover Institution. So these, to me, show his private thoughts and ideas prior to publication. And they also show the influence of his friends. So here's Aaron Director writing to him in 1941, writing to Friedman. He says, quote, "Inflation is basically a monetary phenomenon." That sounds familiar, right? And Friedman he tries to publicize this analysis. He says, this is, quote, "the only half-decent analysis I have seen." So we already have Friedman in the early 40s thinking of inflation in monetary terms. Then I found his teaching notes from 1940 and 1941 when he taught in Wisconsin. And I thought, well, what is he teaching students in the classroom at the University of Wisconsin? And here's what he says, quote, "Public works had adverse effects on the price structure, hence no private investment." So he's talking here about the New Deal. And then he continues on. Also, other business practices of the New Deal, the NRA, the SEC. He also has an argument about the 1937 recession. Quote, "We could argue that government intervention made for lack of recovery." And he concludes by telling his students, quote, "Government spending argument not convincing." So here we have him by the end of the 1940s. He's still in the Chicago framework. He's rejecting this broad interpretation of what the New Deal has done. So I feel like this sort of evidence shows it's not really accurate to say Friedman was ever a Keynesian. Although, annoyingly enough, Friedman says in his memoir, "I was once a Keynesian." And I'm like, this is not true. So sometimes I find myself arguing against Friedman. The context for that was he was referring to work he had done at the Treasury Department. And so to my mind, this is not an accurate reflection of his thoughts. And that's why I did the research to kind of dig and say, what was he, when he was a free individual, sort of teaching what he knew, what did he say? So I can say more about this, and I belabor the point perhaps because there are other scholars who said, no, Friedman really was a Keynesian, or there's also this idea that he was very liberal and he had some road to Damascus moment when, suddenly he became, a free marketer. And that's not really true. From what I've seen is actually the sort of founding insights and values are set early and they continue throughout his career. So let me switch now and talk about the role of women in his work. And I just became more and more convinced this was like the secret of his success. And I just stepped back and thought to myself, well, his major works, A Monetary History of the United States, Capitalism and Freedom, A Theory of the Consumption Function, all of these had a co-author or a major collaborator who was a woman. And that to me was just really surprising and revealing. Now, one of these women was his wife, Rose Friedman. Here, she and Milton are doing the cherry tree, photo by the cherry tree in Washington ritual. You can't see because it's black and white. But this is from early in their career when they were both working in DC and early in their marriage. Now, the other famous collaborator that Michael already mentioned was Anna Jacobson Schwartz. And we've seen that by the 1940s, Friedman had the idea that we could say inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. He at least had this kind of bead on what would be the founding idea of monetarism. He was skeptical of the Keynesian interpretation of the Great Depression and the New Deal. He didn't really have evidence. He had an orientation and a skepticism, but not evidence. And he would make sort of testing these early hunches from Chicago really the major goal of his career. And in the case of unraveling the causes of the Great Depression, it would be Anna Schwartz who did most of the testing for him. Now, Schwartz was a brilliant woman who was sidelined by the pervasive sexism in economics. I talk about this at some length in the book. Her difficulty even receiving a doctoral degree, even after she had completed this path-breaking research. Friedman turned out to be one of the few who recognized her capacity and really engaged with her as an equal in this project. And in the beginning, actually, Schwartz knew way more than he did, and really probably at the end too. She was an expert in British monetary history. She knew all about the Bank of England. She had already traced the evolution of monetary institutions. And together, she and Friedman started piecing together a story about what happened in the United States. And they based this story on an older idea, the quantity theory of money. And this led them to pay attention to the actual literal amount of money in the economy. How did they do this? Okay, it might be hard for you to see because you're far away. This is a legal-sized piece of paper. It says vault cash on the top. It has member bank call dates, another member banks, county banks. These are all figures. These are all written in Schwartz's hand. She's literally the calculator, right? She's the AI of her day, as Bordo suggested. And she's also going out in the field and extracting these numbers from different banks, putting them in large spreadsheets, and they're working them together. They work together for more than a decade. Now, I have to say, this is extremely unusual economics research in the 1940s and 1950s. This is old-fashioned, old school, and quite frankly, women's work. The men are building models using ever more sophisticated mathematical techniques imported from physics and other disciplines. They're not doing this kind of work. But there's Anna Schwartz out there doing it. She's at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and she's been partnered with Friedman through her boss, Arthur Burns, about more later. So eventually, all these charts result in this book, and all those figures and columns come out in these graphs. And these are basically documenting prices and money stock. It's money stock on your, I guess on my right, prices here from 1929 to 1933. And you want to just pay attention to how they go straight and they drop. This is that 1/3 contraction in the overall supply of money in the Great Depression that they document, having done all the measurements. And since they have this sort of almost 100-year framework, they can see this with great clarity. And these charts come from the centerpiece of the book, which is their analysis of the Great Depression. They called it the Great Contraction because of that drop in the supply of money. And they interpreted the Great Depression as essentially a monetary phenomenon. Now, at the same time, Friedman and Schwartz clearly understood the Great Depression as also an institutional and political phenomenon, because they spent great detail in talking about how the Federal Reserve both could and should have prevented this deflation. So the Federal Reserve was supposed to be the lender of last resort. It should have kept those failing banks alive. It should have kept money flowing in the system. And in their account, the Federal Reserve simply stood by and let this happen. Now, it's hard to overstate the importance of this interpretation for the world of policy really ever after. Now, academics have embroidered this account. There was more of a focus on the international context of what's happening. But in terms of policymakers at the Fed thinking, what should I do if there's a crisis? The number one thing they want to avoid is this. The number one thing they want to avoid is being in a Friedman and Schwartz book of the future saying, you just sat there and watched. And so that's why you have this enormous rush into action whenever there is a crisis. So this is a redefinition of the role of the Federal Reserve and what it exists to do, what it should do, and also its power and potency in the economy. Now, probably people in the room here have been paying attention to Jerome Powell and what the Fed board decided, right? We're paying attention to this now. In this stage of Friedman's career, nobody was paying attention to that. Nobody really knew what the Federal Reserve was. You had to sort of be in the system. They weren't publishing data. They weren't making clear speeches. They weren't trying to manage expectations. They were doing none of that. So one of the reasons the Fed moves into such prominence in our contemporary world is that Friedman and Schwartz basically argue the Federal Reserve is responsible for the worst economic crisis in our history. So the Fed is a changed institution after that argument lands. Okay, so the research that I did, helps me see how this breakthrough was made. We see the nuts and bolts of how it was made. And I think doing it in a biographical framework also gives some insight into why Friedman was such a great economist. And in large part, I argue it's because he took people like Anna Schwartz seriously. He simply didn't have this very large blind spot that most of his colleagues did, and he reaped an enormous benefit accordingly. Now, Schwartz is only the most obvious. In my book, I talk about others. I talk about Rose Friedman. I talk about Dorothy Brady, so obscure I couldn't even find a picture of her. I talk about Margaret Reed, who went on to be Friedman's colleague at Chicago. And these women were very deeply involved in his work, A Theory of the Consumption Function, which is one of his more technical works of economics that is still really sort of a foundation of economics today. And so I will say this is not a theme I was looking for, but it was one that I found, and it's pervasive throughout those three Friedmans I talked about. Obviously, Friedman as an economist had, these women collaborators. Friedman as a policy thinker, and Friedman as a public intellectual was very deeply supported by Rose Friedman, who was sort of his ghostwriter, his coach, and eventually his co-author. So if you took these women out of the picture, I argue you'd have a much diminished economist, still someone very noteworthy, but I don't think someone we'd be ranking with Keynes as, arguably one of the top two of the century. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Friedman's impact beyond economics. And I do spend a lot of time in the book on the discipline of economics, hopefully not too much time, but I emphasize that Friedman was really heterodox for most of his career. He was doing this type of empirical work, this women's work, this looking at kind of fine-grained data rather than building models. He really fought the rise of economics as a mathematical science. And this is surprising. A lot of economists I talked to were like, really didn't believe me on this, but I'm like, absolutely. He thought there should be less math in economics, and he fought it his whole career. I cover his argument against the Cowles Commission, which he ran out of Chicago, or the Coles Commission, the sort of first group of econometricians. He won some battles, but he lost the war. And he actually was subject to so much frustration and anger from his peers because he was heterodox, and there was this great desire for unity. Economists were coming into this sort of full flush of their power as a discipline. They were professionalized. They had a pipeline into government. They had congressional committees and the mandated presidential report on economics. And they thought, wow, we could have such influence if only we could agree. But every time we go with our policy proposal, this guy from Chicago pops up and says, no, you've got it all wrong. And then we lose the power of unanimity. So methodologically and politically, Friedman wrecked this kind of vision of economists speaking in one voice. Just to give you a sampling, here's Paul Samuelson talking about Friedman's ideas in a congressional hearing where they're actually both sitting in the room. And here's what he says. I'm talking about the quantity theory specifically. He calls it, quote, almost completely fallacious, a mystical view, a sophomore fallacy, a fabricated concept, right? So Samuelson was just, Samuelson and Friedman clashed quite a bit. But I want to move beyond economics and talk about some of the politicians and policymakers that Friedman connected with. The first one was Barry Goldwater, who sought Friedman out, and he ran for president unsuccessfully in 1964. He was courted heavily by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon really cared about what Friedman thought. Friedman was more ambivalent about Nixon. The real vector of influence of Friedman during the Nixon administration, however, was his friend George Shultz. So here's a picture of George Shultz and Richard Nixon and Friedman in the Oval Office. In particular, they worked together very closely during the end of Bretton Woods. When Friedman had this idea, he had the vision of the world beyond Bretton Woods. He'd had it in the 1950s. It seemed outlandish. Now in the 1970s, as the international monetary order based on Bretton Woods started to kind of tremble and shake, Friedman was whispering in Shultz's ear and just saying, give it a little shove. It's going to be okay. There's going to be a world on the other side. So Friedman was somewhat, Shultz was somewhat Friedman's instrument of policy in that moment. And it came to seem to observers that Friedman's influence was everywhere. This is a slightly disturbing sort of Friedman head graphic from the New York Times Magazine in 1970, but it's showing him with the whole range of policies that he has. We have Social Security that he's trying to get rid of, interest rates, the recession, the negative income tax. There's a whole world of policy conversation that's happening in the 1970s, whether it's Richard Nixon almost passing a family assistance plan, which is really based on Friedman's negative income tax, would have been a UBI, but never came to pass, or the draft moving to a volunteer sort of recruitment model. So it seemed like Friedman's influence was everywhere. But I want to hone in now in particular on one relationship, and that is with Arthur Burns. I have to say, disclaimer, I'm not related to Arthur Burns. And so Friedman had met Arthur Burns when he was a student at Rutgers. Burns was his instructor. And Friedman called Burns his surrogate father. Friedman's father died when he was in his last year of high school, and he arrived in Rutgers, and he sort of didn't know what to do with his life, and he saw Arthur Burns launching himself as a professional economist, likewise a child of Jewish immigrants, and he really latched on to Burns as his kind of confidant and his mentor. And he venerated Burns like no other. So when Burns was appointed to the Federal Reserve chairmanship in 1970, it seemed like a great victory for Friedman. This is probably one of the reasons we get the sort of Friedman bobblehead picture up there. But that's not what happened. It started off well. Friedman was really happy that Burns seemed to be professionalizing the Fed and doing all these great new reforms. But then came a bombshell. Arthur Burns announced his support for incomes policy. So incomes policy was the idea, it's one step away from wage and price controls, that the president or the Congress ought to try to combat inflation by shaping prices sort of persuasively, and if that didn't work, through actual legislation. Now, it's a step on the way to wage and price guidelines. So it's an announcement of a policy he supports, but it's way more than that to Friedman. So I'm going to pause for a moment and read some from the book to kind of give you the texture of what I describe here. Okay. Far more than a policy disagreement, for Friedman, this speech was a profound rupture in his emotional universe. Later that evening, after hours of tossing and turning, Friedman arose from his bed and poured out his anguish. This speech, he wrote to Burns, had left him sleepless, quote, saddened, dismayed, and depressed, he wrote in a passionate letter. Though I know this is not fair or right or generous, the word that keeps coming to mind is betrayed, end quote. How could Burns, who had repeated again and again his stance against wage and price controls, make such a reversal? The letter tacked between incredulity and loss, quote, never in my wildest dreams did I believe that the central bank virus was so potent that it could corrupt even you in so short a time. Friedman mourned. Stepping back for a moment, Friedman grasped that his letter was, quote, melodramatic rather than cold and logical, end quote. But his missives to Burns had always resembled diary entries. Never before had he dissembled or masked his feelings. It was obvious to all who knew him that Friedman loved being the smartest guy in the room. It was also clear he loved to smash idols. Pigou, Kane, Samuelson. His whole life, names others worshipped were his targets. But underneath all this, imperceptibly running through the years, was a contrapuntal desire for a wise man, a counselor, a superior, someone to admire and esteem. Burns, arriving in the fatherless Friedman's life just as he considered his professional future, had played this role for decades. Quote, Arthur, there remains no one whom I so admire and feel so close to, Rose only excepted, and so hate to hurt, Friedman told him in his closing lines. Phew, you thought economics was about rationality. Well, I delved into this relationship more in the book. There are more letters. There is more tension, and eventually the two sort of go their separate ways, and the friendship is never really restored. Friedman predicted rightly that Burns would go from incomes policy to wage and price controls. And he was profoundly disappointed by Burns's erratic monetary policy. He would write him letters that said things like, what in God's name is happening? And as we look back in the Great Inflation, the unsteady monetary policy is often attributed to being a great part of that. Now, This episode, though, tells us something really important about Friedman. It tells us how much he values ideas. It tells you how much he valued honesty, even, at the risk of his closest friendship. And it also reminds us how out of the mainstream his ideas were and how in the mainstream they are now. So Burns could credibly claim in the midst of the great inflation, quote, monetary policy, I feel, has done its job fully. And say that it wasn't the Fed's responsibility, rather in wage and price control should be used. Now, Friedman was not the only person who thought this was a terrible idea. The experience of the 1970s would shift many towards his perspective as they saw that price controls didn't work, as they perceived that inflation had something to do with the Federal Reserve. They would sort of open their mind to his ideas and his larger theoretical analysis. In the book, I talk about other political leaders, how his ideas spread more globally. I have a chapter on his relationship with Margaret Thatcher and the Thatcher Revolution, on his role in Chile. And in an epilogue, I try to take it a little bit up to today and talk about Friedman's continued relevancy for policy, which is obviously a hot topic among the inflation of recent years. I won't go into it much except to say it's an epilogue. I talk about Friedman's concept of the helicopter drop, and I include this graph. This is a measure of Friedman's favorite monetary aggregate, M2, and its spike during the COVID years. Now, this sort of brings us to a paradox. Just as Friedman's central concern, inflation, has reappeared in today's economies, his influence appears at its ebb. Both parties have proposed economic plans that are really the opposite of anything we could call Friedmanomics. So this brings me to my title, and I get asked this over and over again. Why are you calling him the last conservative? So I really want to say there's two reasons I think the title fits. One is what I've covered in this talk in terms of his economics. For if a conservative is one who seeks to conserve, as an economist, this is what Friedman tried to do. From the quantity theory to economic to empirical research, he tried to conserve economic traditions that were being left behind by the bulk of the field. The second reason is Friedman's political alliances. He had a consistent connection to politicians, political movements that called themselves conservative. Now, American conservatism contains multitudes. A really important piece of it in the 20th century was Friedman's free market, sort of libertarian inflected focus on freedom. But that was joined to a Cold War foreign policy and to an embrace of more traditional religious values. But Friedman never disassociated himself from this hybrid movement. Yet as we look at it today, I think conservatism is really changing. There's a new suspicion of markets. There's a new embrace of nationalism, a new reluctance to engage the world. And so I think that Friedman, while he's probably not the last to be called a conservative, he's the last of a certain breed of conservative that was definitive of the 20th century. Yet at the same time, I want to stress that Friedman was not just important to conservatives. He really became an architect of the American political world from the 1970s into the present. In some ways, he came to define the political center, especially in the 1990s after the fall of communism, as the Democratic Party became more market-friendly and kind of, in some ways, tried to adopt Friedman ideas even more so. And this helped me interpret the remark that Joe Biden made in 2020 when he said, quote, Milton Friedman's not running the show. And it was such a curious thing to think about. And that I realized, wow, Milton Friedman is being used here in an intra-Democratic Party fight. He's being used to signal Biden's closeness to the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party and his distance from a wing of the Democratic Party that might think Milton Friedman it has something good to say. So this reminds us that Friedman is really part of the ideological evolution of both the American left and the American right. And his rejection in the current moment is a sign that both parties are looking for something new. I don't really know where they're going to find it, don't really know where it's going to go, but I do know that one way to see ahead is to look back, and that's what I hope this portrait of Friedman provides a way to do. Thank you so much for your attention.
You know, this is such a great book. And from my perspective, which is primarily a central banker's perspective, whenever I thought about Milton Friedman, obviously I was thinking about money and the relationship with inflation. And Canada, so I'm Canadian, and I was a central banker there, adopted actually monetary targeting from 1975, dropped it in 1982. And when I joined the central bank in 2021, oh no, sorry, 2001, my first job was to try to find a stable relationship between money and inflation. And so that just is hope springs eternal for this kind of thinking, because it's so beautiful. And certainly history has proved some episodes where he was right in that sense. I guess the question I have, and one of the things that I learned from this was, well, not only his your book, with not only his interest in many other aspects of policy, not just monetary policy, but his balanced way of thinking, in the sense that, yes, he was focused on efficiency and freedom, but he recognized the trade-offs. And so what I'd love to hear about a little bit more is how you think that he would, his kind of thinking, and the thinking of his peers would be translated to the kind of trade-offs we're facing today. So one of them is just the central bank's monopoly on money, at least settlement in central bank money at the wholesale level, and the rise of stable coins or other kind of options that challenge that monopoly. Another one is just the monopoly. You describe in the book how he says, well, monopolies aren't great, but they're the lesser of two evils, because they might die naturally or be challenged, but governments actually, you can't get rid of them, and in fact they can turn into Frankenstein, as he put it. And so then the nature of monopolies may have been changing with digitalization and AI, where the kinds of, it's not working through prices, it's working through market access or other things, may not be self-correcting. The span of control might be much bigger than we saw with railways, for example. And I guess the final part of it, and I'm just wondering, is it all the same or is it different? Because in the efficiency and freedom space, some of the nature of some of the monopolies is the control over information and the use of data in a way that may impinge on freedom in a way that we hadn't seen before. And I'm thinking about informational integrity, thinking about X or Facebook. It feels like it's at the necessary but insufficient condition for freedom. And I'm wondering, he changed his mind over the years on monopolies, and I'm wondering, do you think this would be a case for him changing his mind again? That's a really unfair question, because you don't know, but you know so much about him.
No, I'm happy to try to tackle it. So I would say one, you started talking about the aggregate, so I'll just touch on that briefly. It's one of these sort of ironies that Friedman in some ways wins the war on money matters, but he loses the battle, in that the specific way he thinks monetary policy should be conducted just proves really infeasible. And part of that is a story of deregulation, and part of that is the complexity of the world. And so it doesn't quite map, but the kind of big picture pieces, I think, are still hold up. If the efficiency versus freedom, I mean, that's one way to think of the trade-offs. This comes a little bit late in his life, but Friedman is willing to say when he's wrong. And one place where he says he thinks he was wrong was globalization. And in emphasizing that, he said, my mantra was privatize, privatize, privatize. And I was wrong, because you need strong institutions first and foremost before you privatize. So I think that was a recognition that he had been a little too quick and too simplistic in his thinking about privatization, and maybe his referent point had been like Britain and the United States. It hadn't been, countries that have lacked like clear rule of law, transparency, cultures of anti-corruption, that type of thing. The other piece of hesitation I saw him coming up with was he started to worry about the sort of low-skilled American worker. And he started to kind of dawn on him like, wow, if we put American workers in a global competition, like they might actually not win that global competition. And what are we going to do about that? So as I described his concern with inequality in the first, I would say probably 2/3 of his career, he really thought the minimum income was the solution. You provide everyone with a minimum income, you've met your sort of moral needs. People have this minimum income. You don't have to build a big bureaucracy. You don't have to adjust it and change it. And it's counter-cyclical. So if people get a job, they might not need the minimum income. If they lose a job, they have it. That is sort of implemented as good as it's going to get in the EITC. And then he starts focusing more on education. And here is where he is really thinking in terms of a monopoly. And his analysis is public education is not working because it's a de facto monopoly and they don't have competition. And so my solution is going to be to inject competition through the voucher program. And that ends up being where he and Rose leave most of his wealth to a school choice foundation. But on the question of monopolies, so I talk about this quite a bit in the 1950s chapter. So Henry Simons, his teacher who eventually passed, was really kind of an old school, I think of him as like the man from the prairie who had that innate American distrust of bigness and concentrated power and always was thinking about the producer and the little guy. And he really passed that on to Friedman. But the monopoly was kind of an exception to the smooth working of markets and the natural process of equilibrium. And in the 1950s, Friedman kind of smooths that out. And he does in part because he gets some empirical studies that show that concentration is not as strong as people are arguing it is in the American economy. So then he comes to say, well, now I have this sort of philosophical consistency and I have my empirical evidence lining up. So I would hope to say that if you were given empirical evidence that we sort of entered a new phase where we are seeing significant consolidation and it's entrenched in a way that won't be broken up, it's quite possible he would change his mind. His concern, though, was something that is created like the ICC to break up one monopoly, then takes on another life of its own. And he even saw this in terms of global institutions. He thought the IMF and the World Bank should be like shuttered. Bretton Woods is over, like shut those guys down. And the fact that they then went on to assume a whole other role as a kind of lender and, restructuring and all that, he wanted that to absolutely stop. So he was worried about these survivals get repurposed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Helpful.
So thanks. Is this on?
Yeah.
It's wonderful being here, and it's just a terrific presentation by Jennifer of really, really terrific book. Absolutely worth reading. And she got right at the end of her presentation to the thing that struck me first when I looked at the book. I mean, just looking at the cover. It's a very, very odd title. And you did a quite good job of defending it, but I still think it's a very odd title. And it's actually echoed on the back of the book. Deirdre McCloskey loves the book,
yes.
As he should. She should. But she also says it's not the right title. And I think you really should let us know quite why you chose that title. So the positions that you set out as Milton Friedman's positions, for instance, being against the draft, having a voluntary army, is that really a conservative position? The whole push of Friedman's policy is really about liberty and about freedom. And so, when you started off thinking about Henry Simons and Frank Knight, you said they were in a sense classical liberals, but then they thought in the context of the New Deal that classical liberalism needed to be reworked, and there was something that needed to be added. You needed to protect institutions.
Right.
That's absolutely right. But fundamentally, the sense of this is always that this is going back to classical liberal principles, and a conservative would say, for instance, that you need an army that everybody serves in, because an army is a way of educating the people and producing a national solidarity and a national consensus. And so, attacking that and saying that the army is just a thing that the market does is very much a liberal thing. And it may be right that conservatives are actually on the right side of that debate, that when you have an army of the kind we have, you get the army involved in senseless things that it wouldn't be involved in if there were everybody involved in it. And So the story of Vietnam is a really classical example of that. Once you have the draft in Vietnam, you have a big mobilization about Vietnam. You have a big discussion of foreign policy. When you don't have a draft, you can do much more adventurous things, and they may be much more dangerous. So that's just an example of the way that I think there is a fundamental consistency, and you emphasize consistency, but it really is a consistency about deeply held liberal principles. And in some ways, liberalism is always going to corrode a conservative order. And I think that's at the heart of this debate. I had a second question, though, that I wondered whether you might reflect a little bit about. I think the book works brilliantly as a kind of guide to the entire 20th century. And you say that at one point, that you think of this as a way of thinking of the course of the 20th century. But the question is, when you address this with a biography, is that really necessarily the right way of doing it? And George Stigler, who you saw on the photograph, George Stigler is the very tall guy.
Yeah.
And they sometimes, you say it, I think, they sometimes call them macro and micro. Stigler was always thinking about how little economists really mattered. And there's a famous essay that he wrote in the middle of this period when Friedman is becoming at his most influential, where he says, fundamentally, it doesn't matter. And he says, the economist is giving advice to society. Economists never cease to preach free trade, although the sermons are getting less and less frequent, and protectionism is growing in the United States. And so that's a sentiment that's really relevant today, because both the parties, both the presidential candidates, the Biden administration continued the Trump tariffs. You've got a kind of consensus against free trade that's in the political system, and it doesn't matter, it's ignored. And then Stigler went on to reflect on that. He said, the great, in order to understand this, the great free trade movement of the 19th century started in Britain with figures like Richard Cobden and John Bright. And Stigler writes, I believe, on the contrary, that if Cobden had only spoken Yiddish and with a stammer, and Peel, the Prime Minister who introduced the trade liberalisation, had been a narrow, stupid man, England would have moved toward free trade in grain as its agricultural classes declined and its manufacturing and commercial classes grew. The repeal of the Corn Laws was the appropriate social response to a shift of political and economic power. And in a sense, I think you see that very much in your story of the 1970s. You told it really quite nicely, that Arthur Burns, who looks as if he's completely lined up with Friedman, turns out to be a disaster as chair of the Federal Reserve. And then Jimmy Carter appoints Paul Volcker, who is very, very anti-Friedmanite. And there's a great deal of tension between Paul Volcker and Milton Friedman. And when Milton Friedman thinks he's influential with President Reagan, Friedman is trying to tell the president that he should abolish the Federal Reserve in the same way as he should abolish the IMF and the World Bank and all of that. And so it's a Democrat, Paul Volcker, appointed by a Democratic president, who really does the big interest rate turn. And I think that has not so much a personal story to it, but an absolute logic of responding to the circumstances of the 1970s, responding to the fact that you got into such a mess with the high inflation levels in the 1970s. And so in that sense, what you need is a kind of shock that gives a learning experience. And in those circumstances, you will get odd confabulations of policy. And it doesn't necessarily come from one person. But what Friedman did that, I think Friedman became a kind of magnet because he was a magnetic figure, really, really charismatic. I remember in the 1970s, 1970s on British television, seeing a debate with Milton Friedman where he had these four people arraigned against him. And one was a young professor of economics in Cambridge, Bob Rothorn, and he just absolutely demolished these guys. They got angry and passionate, and they started shouting at him. And Friedman was always very, very calm, and just managed it absolutely brilliantly. So, he looked charismatic. He was charismatic. He was magnetic. And so what he does is to attract a whole amount of sort of terrible disapprobation. Really, he just sort of attracts all the shit that's held and everything that changes in the 1970s and 1980s. So he becomes the go-to figure that you want to denounce. And it still actually works like that. You had him on the cover of Time. At the beginning of this month, Time had an article on J.D. Vance. And Time blames Milton Friedman talking about welfare queens for the rhetoric of J.D. Vance. And as far as I know, Milton Friedman never used that term. But Milton Friedman becomes the figure that you object to. And because Milton Friedman was talking about the welfare state and worrying about the way in which the welfare state took away individual responsibility, he's suddenly lumped with the nastiest and most racist rhetoric that is associated with critics of the welfare state. So Friedman becomes the object of hatred, I think, and that is in part the story of a charismatic individual. But it's really a tragic story. He had a lot to say. You're right about that. But he becomes really the figure that is demonized when you think about the way the world develops in the late 20th century, the early 21st century.
So, thank you for those comments. I'm afraid I'm going to have to handle them by getting somewhat philosophical in terms of philosophy of history and philosophy of writing history. And your complaint that Friedman is not a conservative reminds me of a debate that was had in the early 1950s when William F. Buckley and others started writing and saying we're conservative, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and a bunch of card-carrying establishment liberals came along and said, no, you're not conservative. This is what a conservative is, a Burkean who talks about faith and tradition, and you're not that person, you can't be conservative. And they went back and forth for a while, and then Barry Goldwater published a book that called itself The Conscience of a Conservative, ran for president, the argument's over. In America, conservatism contains a big dose of what you call in other places liberalism. And that's how it is. And as I examined this debate very early in my career and wrote about it, I decided I would take the operational use of the word as it was used in the specific historical context I was studying, and I would not come in with my bigger framework and try to bash it apart. Now, all that being said, so I'm following the sort of usages, and I'm being empirical in my use of the word. Since I started the book and since I finished it, there has been a more consciousness in the American reading public, I would say, that there is a political philosophy called liberalism, and it is being challenged by illiberalism on the left and the right. And we now know this is where we are. And were I starting this project again, I might find more utility in framing Friedman in a liberal tradition that's now more legible than it was before. But to call Friedman a liberal, given his history in the American political context, to an American readership is just simply nonsensical. And the philosophical piece is that I want to be empirical about my writing of history, and I deeply believe I want to write history that is not read only by other professional historians. I want to reach a larger audience. I feel that's like ethically, morally, and like part of my craft. It's just, I feel that very strongly. So I'm going to meet my audience where they are. But the other ideas you mentioned, like, it's a great story of the 20th century, but how much did Milton Friedman really matter? Like, I am a bit with you on that. But again, how do people understand the world? They understand it through stories, and they most easily understand stories about other people to whom they can relate. So in some ways, Friedman is like the sugar pill, and I want to give you a pellet of economic history, and I'm going to wrap it around this charismatic, interesting figure called Friedman so that you take your medicine. because it's really hard to write a comprehensive history of the 20th century, of economic thought in the 20th century that anyone actually wants to read, because I know I slogged myself through all of them in order to write this one. And so I sometimes do think that we place much too much emphasis on Friedman. He has become a symbol. You know, one man, as he said, I'm persuasive, but I'm not that persuasive, right? And so what I try to do in the book, though, is show how these ideas are in dialogue with other events that are happening. I think that perhaps you, following Stigler, maybe have a bit more deterministic analysis of history than I have maybe a bit more contingent one. So that creates a little more space for Friedman to act as an agent. But throughout the book, I really am striving to show that the same set of ideas in one decade is completely ignored, and in another decade is celebrated, and another decade is despised. And it's because of the lived experience that other people are coming to it with. So I don't actually think we're that far apart, but I think this is the kind of method I'm choosing to communicate with and around. So I think do we take some questions from those in the room? So I think maybe that's a good thing to do.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually went to Chicago for undergrad, and I did 2 years of research assistantship at the Becker Friedman Institute, and
Okay.
I'm currently a student here. So, like, I think, like, my question relates directly to the last comment you made, which is that I think, like, what the outside people and like inside people think about Friedman, especially his like influence within the history of economic thought, is like quite different. Like, I'm a second year student, but like in my like education up to this point, like we don't really learn that much about like what Friedman came up with anymore. Like, even like to us, the face of the Chicago school is really Lucas. Like, he is the central figure of the modern macroeconomics. However, if you ask like a random person, or even like someone who works for a government, the Fed, they would know Friedman much better than Lucas. But so do you think like this is like a very interesting phenomenon? Like Marx said, I'm not a Marxist. I think pretty much something similar happened here. So is it the reason because like he communicates far more with the public to the extent that a lot of people like attribute ideas or models that not necessarily came up by him but by his colleagues to him, or is it just that because he like precisely because the war he lost about like the methodology in economics, to the extent that like real like professional economists can no longer communicate with the public as well as he did?
Yeah. There's a mix of things in your question. Thank you. It's a very rich question. So when Lucas comes along in the early 1970s, that's when Friedman finally loses the war against economic modeling, because Lucas uses modeling sort of in the service of ideas that are more ideologically similar to Friedman. And he's really torn about what to do. And he eventually decides just to keep his mouth shut and sort of be perceived as an ally of Lucas, although Lucas's methodology, he's as opposed to it as he was to the Coles Commission. But he's kind of realizing he hasn't won that. And so I think that in your modern day micro, I'm not sure about macro, but you don't have the tools to connect with Friedman's ideas anymore, because the tools that are being taught are completely different than the ones he used. So he's kind of fading into history of thought. On the other hand, his ideas have been really influential in kind of defining the role of modern central banking. And so I think there's a split between academic economists and the practitioners in the central banking world. And then, yeah, of course, there's an inside Chicago and an outside Chicago split. He also has this whole second life of talking to popular audiences, and living out there on YouTube and all of that, and writing a book. Like any one of us could read A Monetary History or could read Capitalism and Freedom without any type of advanced training, and you would actually get what he's saying. So in that way, he remains influential in those areas that are more the kind of like political economy areas.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. I think my question might aim again at that. I feel now we're dragging out this issue, conservative liberal issue, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about his. I mean, we've seen that he went to the first meeting of the Montpellier Society, and I was wondering, could you flesh out a bit more his relationship with Hayek and sort of the legacy of Mises and the Austrian school, especially because, I mean, in methodology at least, they would differ quite violently, but still you have that classical liberal heritage. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question about Hayek. So he, Hayek invites him to this first meeting, and he really sees himself as aligned with Hayek. Now, Hayek and Simons are also in quite a lot of communication. And I think that what's really frustrating for the biographer is that Hayek ends up at Chicago for 10 years, and I have no idea what they ever did. I'm sure they did a lot, but they're not writing each other letters about it. It's just happening very spontaneously. So we know they went to seminars together.
I'm sorry, can I just intervene on that? I mean, we know very well that Hayek went to the first meeting of some kind of seminar that Friedman organized about British monetary history and thought it was so exceedingly boring and irrelevant that he never went to another one. I mean, there was actually a kind of really big tension between the two of them, and Friedman was the person who stopped Hayek getting appointed to the econ department in Chicago. So Hayek went to the Committee on Social Thought rather than the econ department. And for Friedman, Hayek was a great philosopher, but an absolutely useless economist.
Yeah, they differed quite a bit on how one would do economics, how one would handle inflation. But again, sort of like with Lucas, they sort of kept their mouth shut in terms of their making major public criticisms of each other. I also think that you start to see like Hayekian phrases, like the framework of competition and things like this kind of wending their way into Friedman's work. In terms of the Austrian school, it never found a birth in American academia, although I do think that it has found a place in colleges and universities that tend more conservative in the American sense. And I do think there's actually, like, it's hugely influential in the United States in ways that we don't often recognize. So maybe that's something I'll write about someday. But I think it's like a sleeper system of thought that's out there that's not taught, at a place like Princeton, but it's still very influential.
Atif, I teach economics here at Princeton. You mentioned that he's one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, and obviously that's true. The question I have is why? Because if you were to ask economists sort of who is the most influential, they would probably name Samuelson or Arrow, and I think you also alluded to that. And the question I have is, like, why was he so influential? Obviously, he communicates very well, so that's part of it. But one theory is, and that's partly what I'm asking you to comment upon, is one theory is that it's not that he changed the policy conversation, but that he was useful as a prop for the politicians, given what they wanted to do anyways. So I wonder if you have some, if you can discern which way the causality goes in a way. And then partly because if it's the latter, that he's more being used by the politicians than him influencing the politician, then perhaps that made him even more ideological at some level, because that's what gets you to gain more attention. So I wondered if you can kind of tease out which way the causality actually went.
So I think he's considered influential because he, like Keynes, represents a sort of position in this perennial question of, like, what is the role of government, or how do we trade efficiency and equality? How does the modern industrial state intervene in the economy, in what ways? And so Keynes came to symbolize one set of answers, and this question of, like, there's Keynes and there's Keynesianism, right? They're distinct. And then Friedman came to symbolize another set and came to be connected to political movements that were sort of pushing back in terms of both policy and philosophy of the Keynesian consensus. So where does the influence run? I mean, he definitely is picked up, and I would say, seemed a little strong to say used, but he wants to be part of these movements. He wants to lend his prestige. Like, so in the beginning, he is knocking on Barry Goldwater's door, and he's saying, like, I really agree with you on everything. Like, won't you come have a meeting with me? And Goldwater's sort of ignoring him. And then eventually Goldwater's like, oh, wait, I do need some economists, and sort of goes to him. And so then that campaign is not successful. So we don't really see how it peters out. I would say the Nixon administration, Nixon does all types of things that Friedman doesn't agree with. Yet Nixon does end up abolishing the draft. He does end up proposing a family assistance plan that really originates in Friedman's ideas. And eventually, Friedman has some influence in Treasury as they move beyond Bretton Woods. So I don't know that there's one straight line of causality, but I do think there's definitely symbolism that happens. And Friedman is so media savvy and so telegenic that he becomes easy to symbolize. And then he also helps explain I mean, he's an economics professor. He's really good at explaining like how these ideas work and what they're supposed to do. And so it is really helpful for a politician to say like, yeah, I have this smart guy. And they actually need that. So after World War II, you know, economists staff in the White House, and the White House has to report to Congress in an economically literate way about what it's doing. So you actually have to have economists in government, like by statute. And so you need them. So they're absolutely necessary in both ways. And Friedman, I think, knew he was losing a little bit of something by going into the public realm, but he really accelerated that process when he retired from, you know, full-time research. So when you say he's the most influential economist, we could say he's the most influential public intellectual who is an economist. You know, I think that you're right that the metric isn't quite on how professional economists do their work, which would also be strange if an economist who worked 50 or 60 years ago still was like the foundational methodology of a field. You'd probably say like this field hasn't really developed that much. So,
Thanks so much for all your comments. I'm interested in this famous quote that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Friedman gets to debate this with a lot of people a lot of times throughout his life. There are a lot of different ways you can interpret it. The most aggressive being that monetary is the only thing that affects inflation. The most sort of easy one being that monetary is important for inflation, but there's other things too. And depending on who he's talking to, it can be hard to get a sense of which of those he really believes, where in that spectrum he lies. I'd love to hear from you, everything you've read and seen. What did he really believe in on that spectrum?
yeah, I think when he's talking about inflation, he's talking about a pervasive rise in the rate of increase of all prices. It's a price level thing. It's not like we ran out of leather and so we have made fewer shoes and so we get to charge more for those shoes. You know, it's a kind of pervasive thing. And when it's always a monetary phenomenon, you know, maybe I'll let Mike chime in here if he has anything to add, it's going back to the idea of the quantity theory, and it's going back to he operates as a historian a lot of times, and he takes this kind of 30,000 foot view and is like, basically when you start creating more money than can be absorbed by the economic activity of a society, you have inflation. And he perceives that as, he calls it a regularity, sort of like gravity. Like he really does believe he's uncovered a sort of physical law of the universe in this economic phenomenon. It gets tricky when you start thinking about what is money, and it gets really tricky in a modern economy where you have so many different types of monies, near monies, you have regulation, you have a changing institutional framework. And that's part of why things break down, because it's not just like the emperor minting gold coins and that's kind of the end of it. There's a lot of different things happening. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think we will talk about fiscal. And I think Friedman would have said, look, there's a reason money, increase in the quantity of money increases prices, but why does the quantity of money rise? Okay, so if you look at Friedman's work and the early work that he did where he compared 3 wartime inflations, okay, is that, yes, why is money rising? Because we got a war and we have to pay for the war. Okay, and one of the efficient ways of paying for the war, as Friedman argued, and he was very close to Keynes on this, is by using the inflation tax and printing money. So in a sense, he understood that it wasn't just his story of the helicopter dropping the money, we have inflation. There's a reason for it. And so a lot of work that's gone on since then focuses on that, and Friedman would have been sympathetic to that.
Thank you very much, Professor. I had a question very much related to what Steve was asking about earlier, kind of how we perceive Friedman. And in your book, you kind of make this argument that we often associate him with Pinochet in Chile, but that really shouldn't be the case. And you, I think, rightly point out Harberger as the figure for the Chicago Boys in Chile. But nonetheless, you kind of, you try to argue, actually, Friedman's meetings with Pinochet in 75 were not that important. Friedman's travels to Chile in 82 is kind of not really dealt with in depth in the book as the earlier trip, I think. And so, nonetheless, I'm trying to think about his connections with politicians, kind of, which you do say is very important, even when he disagrees with other politicians. And we talked about Nixon and we talked about Reagan. He does have that influence, but yet in the case of Pinochet, but also broader, I don't know, like maybe reactionary or neoconservative movements outside of the US, you don't assign him that same influence. And I think like Sebastian Edwards has made the case in his book that actually Friedman was kind of important as a referee of economic theories within the case of Chile of the reforms that happened in '75. So I just want to give you maybe an opportunity to comment on that, and the broader question of how did you choose which issues to like poke against the like perceived wisdom of what Friedman is. Like that's one point where you did. The other point is perhaps his positions on civil rights where you're much more critical, and so like it seems like you chose strategically where to kind of flip the the attacks that are often levied against Friedman.
So I think, on the Chile case, I read it as this is a case where Friedman is used not so much by Pinochet, but by a faction within the Pinochet government to kind of solidify a position. And I differ from Edwards in that I see them as having really achieved that position within the kind of interfactional dispute and using Friedman to kind of solidify, where he sees Friedman more as causal. So I think we're maybe just looking at different source material is part of it, because I draw on a travel log that Friedman recorded and that really hasn't been used before of kind of what he did. And he went in and he was like a dignitary, and he spoke to huge numbers of government officials, and they all said, this is going to hurt too much. We can't manage the shock treatment. It's going to be too bad. And he said, no, it's going to be okay. You have to do this. So he was helping, as I see it, legitimate a policy that had been taken already, and that the policy had come about because of this sort of like interfactional struggle within the government, responding to, we haven't fixed this inflation problem. We have to do something. We've tried one set of policies. Let's try another set. And the set of policies they brought up, yes, to some degree was Chicago school influence, but it also was a pretty standard, like if you have lots of inflation, you need to stop printing money. Like, it wasn't sort of novel in that way. And so I felt it was sort of unavoidable to engage the Chilean question, because that's become one of these symbolic pieces that's so linked. And also I just found it a really fascinating history. And he was there sort of for 6 days, and he had the intervention he had. I feel in the case of civil rights, this is an American advising a critical issue in his own country and advising a presidential candidate in his own country. And Friedman was an economic advisor to Barry Goldwater, and he took it upon himself to start commenting on, explaining, and defending Goldwater's stance on civil rights. Like, nobody asked him to do that. It wasn't part of his bailiwick. He had no expertise in the subject, and he really extended himself on that. So I felt like he was kind of inviting scrutiny for, like, why are you doing this? And I also feel in the beginning of the civil rights era, civil rights was really a Republican Party issue. It was pushed forward by Republicans because the Democratic Party was so strong in the South. This is like the legacy of the Civil War. And then over time, there became a split as conservative Republicans became more powerful within the party. The dividing line between moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans was your stance on civil rights. And over the course of the 60s, moderate Republicans were extinguished and basically became Democrats. And so I feel it's a question of what is the agency of the intellectual. It's an open question, but if Friedman had said civil rights is a libertarian cause, this is the cause of human freedom and liberty, and had kind of put a stake in the ground, might he have created space that would have created a more ideologically diverse Republican Party, or at least given oxygen, breathing room, and space to moderate Republicans? So I see the universe of possibility as much broader in that particular case than in the Chilean case. So that's part of why I focus on it more. But there are so many, you have to just make choices eventually, and the book is long enough as it is. So some of them are where the source material leads you, some of them is where your interest leads you, some of them are the questions that you know you're going to get, and so you might as well tackle them ahead of time. Sure.
So I was really curious about your views on some of the recent critiques of Milton Friedman's thinking that I've come across, which is about his supposed ambivalence toward democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it goes back to the previous question, but there are other examples of, for instance, his admiration for the Hong Kong model in the 70s. And this is also very relevant to our questions today, because this tension between liberal focus on economic rights versus political rights is also a question today, right? And it seems as if, at least some people's view is that he fell on the side of trying to protect economic rights, even if it comes at the cost of losing democratic values. What is your reading of that, his views on this?
It's a good question. I think he shifted on that. So he enjoyed provoking, and he enjoyed he felt in the United States that economic rights were undervalued by, let's say, the intelligentsia, and he wanted to sort of stand up for them. And he felt it was really important to argue economic rights are really important rights too, and they're fundamental in some ways to a lot of other rights. We can't just segregate them off. And so then you see of course, this goes back to the Chilean question. You know, he has some he's criticized so heavily for that, and he's really surprised. He doesn't sort of see that coming. And then he goes back to, that's in 76, that's where he gets the Nobel Prize. He goes back to Chile, and he finds that there are now Chileans arguing that, and one of the critiques is that, capitalism is the tool of the dictator. And of course, Friedman thinks capitalism is the tool of freedom. And then he gets to Chile, and he finds Chileans making this argument and saying, we can only have capitalism in a dictatorship. And he's like, no, wait. And once he sees people making the strong form of that argument, then he becomes more committed to talking about democracy and saying that political rights are really important. And he sort of realizes in the American context, it's one thing to push economic rights, but then in a context where there isn't strong political rights, to just push economic rights is more problematic. So he kind of backs away from that. And then in the end of his life, he's really befuddled by sort of the Hong Kong case and the case of the Asian tigers. And he starts saying, well, there's a new type of freedom. Like there's economic freedom, there's political freedom, and then there's civic freedom. And like this pertains to like you have some rights of assembly and you don't have like a Stasi, going through your garbage, but you actually can't vote in democratic elections. And so he's perceiving that this is what's happening in a lot of the Asian countries, that they're capitalist, but they're not politically free. And he's like trying to work it out. So it's like a clumsy attempt, I think, to address this and to sort of recognize like my theory derived from like the Cold War binary world is not really mapping on where we are right now. But he desperately wants to believe that like capitalism and freedom go together like peanut butter and jelly. So he gets in a little bit of trouble when he figures out that it doesn't. Then he has to kind of massage that. Thanks everyone for coming.